All right, I want to welcome you to this lecture, which I hope will be shorter than the normal length lectures. Uh, this is a continuation of our introduction to adult learning theories, and we are trying to first get an overview and then we start digging deeper into the theories. In the last introductory lecture, we talked about adult learning in general, and we also ended on the note of identifying the three foundational theories of adult learning, which three we assigned each an adult educator who is a proponent. And those three foundational ones we talked about were andragogy, self-directed learning, and transformative learning. And if you remember very well, we noted that Malcolm Knowles is the proponent behind andragogy, Alan Tuff behind the self-directed learning, and Jack Mezirow behind the transformative learning. And that is where we want to pick it up from to say a few things about these foundational theories before we move on to the other theories that come after these traditional ones. Beginning with the andragogy, I am sure the three of you who are on call are aware that um, we have this andragogy coming from the grandfather of adult education or adult learning, that is the American Malcolm Knowles. And it is very important for us to note that he introduced this seeming theory, which he ran away from calling a theory later. He introduced it as a new label and a new technology that would distinguish the learning of children from that of adults. So, in his view, adults would learn in a different way, but we note also that what turned out was that Malcolm Knowles was sharing mainly characteristics of adults or adult learners rather than the how they learn or the nature of their learning. And that means that he was just looking at the learner and how the learner works. He was helping us to understand our adult learners and how therefore to deal with them. So, from the criticisms that he received, that these were just assumptions that he was giving and characteristics about a learner rather than the how, the real how an adult learner learns, he then resorted to calling this seeming theory as a continuum that ranges from teacher directed pedagogy or teacher directed learning to from on one end, and then learner directed learning or student directed learning and andragogy on the other end. And he agreed that any of these would be relevant to both the adults and children depending on the situation. And I refer to what we talked about in the last lecture, that they are actually learners, adult learners, who feel that their learning activities and learning situation should be governed by direction, should be governed by limits, should be directed, should be um, organized by someone else with deadlines and instructions and so on. And yet, there are those children also who may be self-directed in a way, self-directed by way of independence in decision making or taking control of their learning. They decide what they want to learn, when to learn it. Probably the how can be compromised between the facilitator and or the architect of the learning and the learner. But what we are saying here is that Malcolm Knowles accepted that andragogy is just a continuum of student-centered learning vis-a-vis teacher-centered learning or facilitator-centered learning. So using these assumptions about adult learners, excuse me, Knowles' 1980 program planning model attends to, for example, making the adult classroom a place suitable for adults both physically and psychologically. Further, since adults direct their lives in society, they can also and most often want to direct their own learning. And this is what drives us now to the next theory of self-directed learning, which is quite connected to andragogy. And from this slide, we see that while self-directed learning appeared about the same time that Knowles introduced andragogy, actually self-directed learning is an extension of one of the assumptions about adults as self-directed learners, because we know very well that it is Malcolm Knowles who proposed that adult learners or adults are self-directed. They govern their urge, their motivation to learn. They decide, they choose what they want to learn and when to learn it, and probably for what purpose. So self-directed learning comes in as an extension, and Alan Tuff took it up and proposed that self-directed learning is mainly about the adults taking control of their own learning, rather than an adult sitting in the classroom alone and learning. That is not what it means, but rather the control that the learner takes to decide where they want to take their learning. So where did this come from? Alan Tuff conducted a study and found out that 90% of his participants had engaged in an average of 100 hours of self-planned learning projects the previous year. Now, this is what informed him to come up with this concept and later a theory of self-directed learning, meaning that an adult can plan their own learning escapade, their own learning as undertaking. And what happens is that this learning usually happens in people's day-to-day lives, our everyday lives, because we are aware also that we learn informally, we learn non-formally, and of course there is also learning in the formal setting. It is only that in most cases people regard learning situations to be in the formal nature, and in a way also in the non-formal nature. But informally, it takes someone who understands a little more about learning by people to appreciate that there is also learning in our everyday life, even when we are alone and we are not in organized settings. So self-directed learning, the central issue here is the adults taking control of their own learning. And we see a volume of literature on self-directed learning, and this includes numerous models of the process, the sample, learner contracts, assessment tools that measure the extent of learners' self-directedness. Transformative learning, on the other hand, is to do with the cognitive process of meaning making. When we make meaning out of what we learn, which meaning is dependent on something that has happened, then we are operating under this the transformative learning theory or mode of learning. This has been considered as an adult learning theory because transformative learning is dependent on adult life experiences and a more mature level of cognitive functioning. That is why we are referring to cognitive process of meaning making. Now, this is not very obvious. We can't say that it is absent totally, but it is not very obvious among children. Why? Because it involves a level of self-reflection on what has happened. And not very many children are ready to go through that, to look at their experiences and then make meaning out of it. In most cases, it is adults, especially in times when they experience challenges or failures, that they reflect and start asking themselves, why did it happen? What led it to happen? And then to draw lessons for the future. And that is where transformative learning comes in. And with transformative learning, we expect that after that reflection, we expect that the action that will be taken later, whether in the same arrangement of situation or circumstances or different circumstances, the action would be different because it has been informed by a reflection based on an earlier action that may have been challenging or that might have led to a challenging situation. So Jack Mezirow studied the experiences of women who had returned to college, and therefore he arises as the main architect of this theory of transformative learning. And we have seen that several frameworks, definitions, and theories have been now proposed within this mode of learning. So learning in adulthood is often more than just adding information, but it involves a change of perspective, a change in attitude, a change in beliefs, which is emanating from a reflection on our experiences that we would have gone through. So a perspective transformation is expected from transformative learning. Actually, the product of transformative learning engagement is a perspective transformation or a transformed perspective, a different, renewed, revised, reviewed perspective, either to life or to action or to operation or to thinking, whatever it is that someone would have learned. So Mezirow's 2000 publication that has the 10-step transformational learning process is a key in today's research, and we see that there has been quite an amount of research around transformative learning, and it is taken that transformative learning may be one of the most researched areas or theories or aspects within adult learning. So these three traditional theories help us to understand um, adult learning in a special way as compared to learning by children. But as we see that these three seem to be a bit chronological, one leading to the other, and Raboji producing self-directed learning, and then thereafter going into transformative learning. Even by the years that we see them arising, we see that there is a chronology that has been followed. So Meziro focused on personal individual transformation, and on the other hand, he also acknowledges the the influence of the Brazilian educator who we all know, Paulo Freire. And we know very well that Paulo Freire was a facilitator of adults who believed that by creating awareness through basic literacy would help to awaken the minds of people, beginning with the Brazilians, of course, so that they could fight for their freedom and also cause social change. Not only social change, but also socio-economic change, because we know very well that when you free yourself from oppression, you also gain some influence that will lead you to move forward economically. We know very well that without power, you may not be able to make it through economically. So it takes someone to free themselves. Now, Meziro acknowledges the transformational learning by Paulo Freire, and in framing this transformative learning. So that is where we see that this transformative learning becomes quite popular in the adult learning discussions and perspectives today. And I want to pause right now so that I can be sure that we are moving together. So if you have something to note, something to comment, or something to clarify, you can raise it now before we continue. Those are the three traditional theories, but it doesn't mean that these are the only theories to adult learning that we are going to look at. Now, I want us to note something here that is going to be key as we move on to the next set of theories that followed through. There is a claim that these three traditional theories were emphasizing mainly the individual and the basis of an individual's learning, and that these three theories ignored or left aside the issues of the social context, including the political situation or political influences in our society, how they influence. And when we talk of political, we are not talking about the National Unity Platform, NRM, and so on. We are talking about um, power, the power distribution, who has the power and who doesn't have the power. And the other theories are coming to bring in another perspective that has influence on how adults learn. So I want us to note that key aspect, that andragogy, self-directed learning, and transformative learning all focus on individual adults, on how individual adults learn. How individual adults learn. So we are talking, they are emphasizing um, learning from an individualistic point of view. And while each of these theories has contributed to our understanding of adult learning, each of these has been criticized for lack of attention to the social and political context. And this is what I was emphasizing in this transition. So the questions that help us to understand how these three theories have been challenged are: one, how self-directing can someone be in an oppressive social context? Now, this is to do with the political nature. And oppressive can move from even a family setting, a family context, a family situation. How can you be self-directed if you do not have any room to take decisions, to have any control in a home? How can you decide when you want to learn if someone else, for example, if you are a woman, or maybe I should use a man, if you are a man, how can you decide when to learn, as in when, at what point to learn, when it is your wife who is determining the schedule of activities in the home, or vice versa? Now that is politics. How can you be self-directed in such a situation? Of course, it moves on to other arrangements in a community. If there are certain schedules for women, for men, how can you be self-directed and in your learning in such a situation? Then number two, can transformative learning, for example, take place if one is not exposed to alternative ways of thinking about an issue or problem? In other words, we have seen that transformative learning comes from reflecting on a challenging situation that has taken place. But we see that exposure is very important here. Exposure is very important. If you believe, or you have been trained to believe, that there is only one way of thinking, for example, just off head, if you have been traditionally told that God is male, then and they say that we are created in God's image, and then if you cannot alternatively think that if God is male, then in whose image were women created? So are women also in the image of a male God? And that is where the reflection starts and go on. But then it takes exposure to have a context or framework of reasoning alternatively for transformative learning to take place. And this continues to all aspects of life, especially in challenging situations where someone needs to take lessons and and change their actions in future as they address a certain problem or a certain situation. So, attention in the late 20th century turned to the role of context in shaping adult learning. So, context comes in. And when we talk of context, we are talking about the social context in most cases, the social context. So this became prominent and remains an important component in understanding adult learning today. The context within which the adults learn has an influence on how and whether they learn. That is the key thing here. That you cannot talk about adult learning without talking about context, and that is what we are going to see in the subsequent theories that explain how adults learn. So there are two key strands of research and writing that attend to this context of adult learning. And one of them is the critical perspectives, and the other is situated cognition or contextual learning. Situated, located learning, contextual learning, the context within the situation within which learning is taking place. So the critical social science perspectives shift attention from the individual learner to the social context. From the individual learner in the other three, the andragogy, self-directed learning, and transformative learning, to now social context as an influence to learning. So we are going to see how these build the other perspective of social context. Now, as these perspectives draw from Marxism, the critical theory, critical race theory, queer theory, feminist theory, and multiculturalism. This perspective asks questions about how race, class, and gender impact the structures in society. So we are seeing that race, each one of us has a race from which we come. Each one of us belongs to a class. Of course, these are social constructions. And each one of us belongs to a certain gender. Of course, today we know that gender is becoming a tricky issue. Today, someone is a man, tomorrow they are a woman, or they are female, the other time they are male. And but still, it gives context. It gives context. And when someone shifts, like for those who choose to shift, then that means that their context has also shifted. So we shall see these being reflected in the other theories that we are going to mention, that we are going to list, and which we are going to study for most of this course. So this is what I've been mentioning. Who holds power, and how do the powerful shape society and with the intention of reinforcing their status? And this has a connotation on learning, and that is why Paulo Freire, who was recognized by Meziro in transformative learning, Paulo Freire was looking at the social context of people, the oppression that was existing, and we know very well that he believed that the oppressed needed to liberate themselves, but not only themselves, but to liberate the oppressors also, because the oppressors were also engulfed and imprisoned in their nature of oppressing others. Now, that required a change in context. And that means that those who felt deprived did not have to think of just capturing the power from the powerful, excuse me, not only capturing the power from the powerful, but having a new perspective of how to use that power, not just to reinforce their status or to maintain their status and keep others away, but to make sure that this power is neutralized and equally shared in the sense that everyone can have their own share of development but also freedom. Now, when it comes to critical theory, Brookfield and Holst in 2014 point out that from a critical perspective, there are three major problems with the individual orientation of andragogy, self-directed learning, and transformative learning. So Brookfield, who we see has taken the lead in writing about critical theory and of course researching about critical theory, is the one that gives us these key questions or points of challenging the individualistic nature or individual orientation of the other three perspectives, and therefore causes need for the social context in these other perspectives. So these are the three aspects or issues to note. One is the self. The self cannot stand outside the social, cultural, and political streams within which it swims. In other words, each individual is immersed in a social context. You cannot learn in isolation of the social context. It just gives emphasis that the social context, the cultural context, the political context is part and parcel of a person, and therefore their learning, particularly for adults. Number two, that self-direction as a form of learning, emphasizing separateness, leads us to equate it with selfishness, with the narcissistic pursuit of private ends, regardless of the consequences of this pursuit for others. That means that when someone is going through the processes of self-direction, that means that there is no consultation. There is no consultation and there is no regard for others who are within the social system. It also assumes that a person is in isolation of the political situation or the political arrangement that they live in, which is not true. It assumes that everyone has their own independence, their own volition, their own space, which is not true. We know very well that that is an assumption, but it is not true. For example, if you are still being led, you are not the head of the family. It is very difficult for you to have your own programs. Tomorrow I'm going to wake up very early and move out of here and go and sit in the library. Just an example. But tomorrow morning you may wake up and they tell you, no, you are not going anywhere. You need to clean up, then you need to feed the dogs or wash them before you go to do anything else. That is the political context. So the decisions that an adult takes in terms of being self-directed in their learning are not in isolation of the political and even the cultural situation or context in which they live. And I think we can see merit in this second aspect. And the third, which is the last one also, is that a view of learning that regards people as self-contained, volitional beings, scurrying around in individual projects is also one that works against collective and cooperative impulses. We know that humans are social beings. Actually, some people say that a human being is a social animal. We are social, we are connected, we are cooperative. And most of the problems that we face do not affect us alone. And I'm saying most, not all problems. Of course, there are those that affect us individually, but most of the problems have an effect on others. And that is where the cooperation comes in. And so Brookfield comes in to note that thinking that adults are self-directed should not be overemphasized. It should not be taken to a very high level of thinking that adults are self-contained. They are on their own, or they are an island by themselves. But they are interconnected, and that interconnectedness, those relationships form a social context. And these three aspects are the ones that form the impetus for now thinking about the alternative theories which bring in the social context. And of course, we are seeing this from a critical perspective. And we know that being critical is being intense and being quite deliberate and going deeper to look at issues and aspects. I've already mentioned that Brookfield becomes the most prominent writer and researcher in the critical theory perspective, and we shall have these pieces of work that we are going to be reading as we address each of these theories. So don't worry about them. We shall progressively look at these pieces of work and appreciate them. So he proposed a theory of adult learning that has at its core an understanding of how adults learn to recognize the predominance of ideology in their everyday thoughts and actions in the institutions of civil society. Now, we know very well that ideology is to do with beliefs, and these beliefs govern a society, a group of people. It much as some people also have their individual ideologies, but that is being selfish. But now we are talking about society and the social nature of ideology. So we are saying that according to Brookfield, social ideology is at the center of learning. Social ideology, or a social orientation, the recognition of the social nature of learning, and the belief that when we learn and the actions that we take have a connotation on other members of society whom we live with in these institutions of society, be they family, be they jurisdictional arrangements like villages or whatever it is. So the self-directedness, yes, is true, but then it also has to factor in the social aspects and the social influences that may be leveled on learning. So while Brookfield is the major theorist, we see that there are others who have also contributed to the development of our understanding and the understanding of adult learning. But most importantly, this critical science, social science perspective has been embraced by many researchers and writers in adult education and human resource development. So that is at the side of the critical theory, or the critical social science theory of adult learning. So what we see introduced here mainly is the social context